In Hollywood, silence has always been safer than truth. For Dvorak, that lesson arrived early and stayed with her long after the industry stopped listening. Her story did not begin with scandal, but with promise, the kind of promise that studios recognized immediately, then moved quickly to contain. She arrived in the early 1930 seconds, when the studio system had perfected its grip. Contracts were ironclad, morality clauses were weapons, and ambition was tolerated only when it aligned with obedience. Dvorak possessed something that made executives uneasy: intensity without submission. She did not smile on cue. She did not treat roles as favors. She wanted to act, not to be managed. Warner Brothers signed her at a moment when the studio was hungry for realism. The Great Depression had changed audience tastes. Gloss felt dishonest. Grit sold better. Dvorak's performances carried weight, a sense of lived-in truth that cameras could not manufacture. In films like Scarface in 1932, she did not decorate scenes, she unsettled them. The audience noticed. So did the studio. Fame followed quickly, but it came packaged with expectation. Warner Brothers did not invest in actresses to explore themselves. It invested in assets to be deployed. Roles were assigned, images crafted, schedules enforced. Dvorak was expected to comply gratefully. Instead, she hesitated. She questioned scripts. She rejected parts she believed diminished her work. These refusals were recorded, not forgiven. Hollywood does not punish dissent immediately. It documents it. By 1934, the industry had changed tone. The production code tightened, and studios grew increasingly concerned with control over stories, over morality, over people. Actors who resisted direction were no longer seen as principled. They were framed as unstable, uncooperative, dangerous to investment. Dvorak's insistence on artistic choice placed her squarely in that category. She wanted to study, to travel, to step away from the assembly line of roles and develop her craft. To Warner Brothers, this was unacceptable. Contracts did not accommodate growth. They demanded availability. When Dvorak requested time away, the studio responded with legal pressure. Absence was framed as breach. Independence became insubordination. The battle that followed was quiet but devastating. Warner Brothers suspended her without pay, a tactic designed to starve resistance. Publicly, nothing dramatic occurred. Privately, her career stalled. Offers vanished. Her name began to circulate alongside words like difficult and unreliable. The language was vague enough to deflect scrutiny, specific enough to damage her reputation. This was the scandal that would never be called one. The press, fed selectively, echoed the studio's position. Dvorak was portrayed as temperamental, spoiled by early success, incapable of gratitude. The narrative stuck because it served a purpose. It warned others. Artistic ambition, when exercised without permission, carried consequences. What the public never saw was how calculated the response had been. Warner Brothers did not simply discipline Dvorak. It isolated her. By freezing her out, the studio ensured that her absence appeared self-inflicted. She had walked away from opportunity. The story went. She had chosen obscurity. The truth was more precise. She had chosen autonomy. In 1937, after years of legal conflict and professional stagnation, Dvorak's contract dispute reached a breaking point. The studio had won without ever going to court. Time itself had done the work. Her momentum was gone. Younger actresses had replaced her. Hollywood's memory had shortened. When she returned to film, it was under different conditions. Smaller studios, fewer guarantees, roles that lacked the reach she once commanded. The industry welcomed her back politely, but not eagerly. The damage had been done. Hollywood had learned its lesson. So had everyone else. Dvorak's story was reframed in retrospect as a cautionary tale. Talent was not enough. Intelligence was risky. Independence was fatal. The system did not need to banish her completely. It only needed to ensure that her example was clear. What made this erasure especially effective was its subtlety. There were no exposés, no courtroom dramas, no public reckoning, just a gradual rewriting of her significance. Her early work was praised, then footnoted. Her absence was explained away as personal failure. The scandal that silenced Anne Dvorak was not about sex or crime or spectacle. It was about control, about a woman who believed her career belonged to her and an industry determined to prove otherwise. By the end of the decade, her name no longer carried the weight it once had. She was remembered, if at all, as someone who might have been more if only she had played along. Hollywood prefers its tragedies tidy. Dvorak's refusal disrupted that preference. It introduced the possibility that the system itself was at fault. Rather than confront that possibility, the industry chose silence. It buried the conflict beneath labels and let time complete the erasure. What remained was a question that would linger long after her voice faded from the screen. What does it cost to say no in a place built entirely on compliance? For Anne Dvorak, the answer would unfold slowly, across years of diminished opportunity and unspoken consequence. And the full price had yet to be paid. By the mid-1930s, Anne Dvorak understood something most actresses learned too late. Hollywood contracts were written to look like opportunity and function like restraint. The promise was visibility. The reality was obedience. What made her dangerous to the system was not rebellion, but clarity. Warner Brothers had built its power on discipline. Actors were not collaborators. They were inventory. Studios decided where you worked, how you spoke, what you played, and when you rested. Leaving town without permission could trigger penalties. Refusing a role could result in suspension. Time itself became leverage. If you resisted long enough, your career would erode quietly, without confrontation. Dvorak encountered this mechanism firsthand after Scarface elevated her profile. The film's success gave her a sense brief, intoxicating that leverage might exist. She believed that strong work earned negotiation. Warner Bros. Believed the opposite. Success increased obligation. Scripts arrived with little discussion. Roles followed a pattern she found hollow. She asked for better material, more depth, more time. These requests were noted, then denied. Each conversation shifted her standing slightly downward. Not enough to be obvious, enough to be remembered. The studio's response was procedural. When Dvorak asked to travel and study in Europe, to refine her craft beyond the factory rhythm of Hollywood, Warner Brothers framed the request as breach of contract. The language was legal, not emotional. Contracts did not recognize artistic development as necessity. Only compliance mattered. Her departure, when it came, was treated as abandonment. Publicly, Warner Brothers said little. Silence was strategic. Privately, it moved to suspend her without pay. This punishment required no explanation. It froze her career while preserving the appearance of choice. She was free to return on the studio's terms. This tactic worked because of how Hollywood functioned socially. Studios communicated informally. A suspended actress was marked. Other producers hesitated. Risk followed her name. Dvorak did not need to be blacklisted formally. The chill was enough. The press filled in the blanks predictably. Stories circulated describing her as restless, difficult, ungrateful. None cited specific incidents. None needed to. Ambition, in a woman, was explanation enough. The narrative hardened quickly. She had squandered her chances. She had misunderstood her place. What remained unspoken was how narrow that place had been. Dvorak's refusal to return immediately was not defiance for its own sake. It was an attempt to reclaim authorship over her work. She believed, perhaps naively, that her talent justified autonomy. Warner Brothers believed that autonomy undermined authority. The conflict was inevitable. As months passed, the cost of absence became visible. Roles she might have played went to others. Her name faded from marquees. Momentum, once lost, proved impossible to recover fully. Hollywood thrives on continuity. Interrupt it, and the system replaces you without remorse. When Dvorak eventually returned, it was under diminished circumstances. Smaller studios offered roles Warner Brothers no longer considered valuable. These parts lacked reach, budget, and publicity. She was working again, but outside the machinery that manufactured prominence. The industry treated this outcome as confirmation. She had stepped away and paid the price. The lesson was clear and useful. Actors who questioned authority could survive, but not thrive. Independence came at the cost of scale. What made the situation particularly corrosive was how it reframed her choices retroactively. Her desire to study was recast as instability. Her refusal to accept weak material was reframed as arrogance. The system absorbed her dissent and repackaged it as flaw. Hollywood excels at this transformation. Dvorak felt the shift keenly. She was no longer discussed as a rising talent, but as a complication. Meetings were polite, cautious, offers came with conditions. The ease that once surrounded her name was gone. She had not lost ability. She had lost protection. The scandal that silenced her did not require headlines. It operated through contracts, whispers, and time. Warner Brothers never needed to destroy her outright. It only needed to demonstrate what happened when an actress asserted control over her own labor. This demonstration extended beyond Dvorak. Other performers watched. They adjusted behavior accordingly. Compliance increased. Silence spread. The studio system strengthened. For Dvorak, the damage was cumulative. Each year away from prominence narrowed her options further. Each role accepted under diminished terms reinforced the narrative that she had peaked early. Hollywood prefers arcs that descend neatly. The tragedy was not simply that she lost status. It was that her original demand for artistic integrity was erased from the story entirely. What survived was a cautionary outline stripped of context. She became an example without explanation. By the late 1930 seconds, Anne Dvorak was still working, still capable, still intense, but the industry had learned how to see past that. It had reduced her to a lesson. And lessons, once learned, do not require ongoing attention. The cage had done its work. What remained was the slow realization that the cost of saying no was not immediate exile, but something far more enduring. A career allowed to continue just enough to prove the system's point, while never again permitted to reach its full voice. The silence around her was not accidental. It was instructional. By the late 1930 seconds, Anne Dvorak was no longer being actively punished. That phase had passed. What replaced it was something far more effective: definition. Hollywood had decided who she was, and once defined, she no longer needed to be opposed. She could simply be managed by absence. Reputation in Hollywood has never depended on documentation. It depends on circulation. A word passed quietly between offices carries more weight than any official statement. By the time Dvorak resumed steady work outside Warner Brothers, her name arrived before she did, already shaped, already constrained. She was talented, everyone agreed. But there was always a pause after that acknowledgement, a hesitation, a look exchanged. Talent, they implied, was not the issue. Silence had done its work. No studio publicly criticized her. No producer openly condemned her choices. Instead, she was described in conditional terms: reliable enough, intense but unpredictable, capable but complicated. These half-judgments were never written down, which made them impossible to refute. They lingered just long enough to redirect opportunity elsewhere. Hollywood is careful with its exclusions. Formal bans invite scrutiny. Informal consensus invites none. Dvorak continued acting, but the terrain had shifted beneath her feet. Roles arrived sporadically, often without momentum or support. Films were released with minimal promotion. Her performances were praised in isolation, then forgotten in the churn of new faces. The machinery that once amplified her work no longer engaged. This quiet marginalization was harder to resist than open conflict. There was no clear injustice to confront, no decision to appeal. Only the steady sense that doors no longer opened the way they once had. For an actress who had built her early career on intensity and emotional depth, this was a particular kind of erasure. Dvorak was not fading because she had lost ability. She was fading because the industry had learned how to proceed without acknowledging her presence. What made this period especially corrosive was how thoroughly the narrative shifted responsibility onto her. Her diminished visibility was framed as consequence, not retaliation. She had stepped away. She had chosen differently. The system had simply adjusted. This framing protected Hollywood while isolating her further. To argue against it would have required public confrontation, something she had learned carried long-term cost. Silence, once imposed, becomes habit. Dvorak felt the narrowing keenly. She took roles where she could find them, often in productions that lacked the reach or care she once commanded. These projects kept her working, but they did not rebuild her standing. Hollywood measures relevance by continuity, not by craft. The years passed this way, without rupture but without recovery. The press, which had once followed her ascent, treated her now as a curiosity, a name from earlier promise. Occasionally, articles referenced her independence with a tone that suggested regret rather than respect. She had talent, the implication went, but she had mismanaged it. The simplicity of this explanation made it durable. What was lost in that simplicity was the power imbalance that had shaped her choices. Warner Brothers had controlled distribution, publicity, and access. To step away from that machinery was not an artistic pause. It was an economic gamble taken without safety net. The consequences were structural, not personal. Hollywood did not correct this misunderstanding. It benefited from it. Dvorak's interior life during these years is difficult to reconstruct precisely, but the pattern is familiar. A performer trained to believe in merit confronts a system that rewards compliance more than quality. Confidence erodes. Self-doubt replaces conviction. Each opportunity feels provisional. The silence around her grew heavier because it was ambiguous. Had she failed? Had she been forgotten? Or had she simply reached an expiration date the industry never disclosed? Hollywood thrives on this ambiguity. It discourages collective understanding. Each individual interprets their own decline as unique, even when it follows a recognizable pattern. For Dvorak, the pattern was becoming unmistakable. She had challenged authority once and survived. But survival, she now understood, did not mean restoration. It meant being allowed to exist on the margins, as proof that the system was fair. She was not destroyed. She was diminished. This distinction mattered to Hollywood. It allowed the industry to maintain its moral narrative. Actors were free to make choices. The story went. They were simply responsible for the outcomes. Power disappeared from the equation. The tragedy of this framing was how thoroughly it isolated her. Without open conflict, there was no rallying point. Without acknowledgement of injustice, there was no remedy. Dvorak carried the consequences privately, while the industry carried on uninterrupted. As the 1,940 seconds approached, her position stabilized at a lower altitude. She worked, but without trajectory. Her early promise was recast as youthful intensity rather than lasting potential. The future she had imagined narrowed to maintenance rather than growth. Silence, once imposed from the outside, had become internalized. She no longer expected advocacy. She no longer trusted recognition. She had learned what Hollywood intended her story to be, and how firmly it intended to keep it there. The scandal that had silenced Anne Dvorak was never revisited publicly. It did not need to be. Its lesson had already been absorbed. And as long as silence continued to function as reputation, the system that enforced it remained invisible, its power exercised without ever needing to speak its name. By the early 1,940 seconds, the immediate conflict between Anne Dvorak and the studio system had faded from view. but its consequences had settled into her life with quiet permanence. Hollywood had a way of allowing time to absorb controversy until what remained looked less like punishment and more like fate. Dvorak's career entered this phase without ceremony, shaped not by a single decision but by the residue of many. She was no longer openly resisted. She was simply not pursued. Opportunities arrived sporadically, often from smaller studios or independent producers willing to take modest risks. These roles were not insignificant, but they lacked the amplification that had once carried her work into public consciousness. Distribution was narrower. Promotion was restrained. Performances passed through theaters without echo. Hollywood had learned how to contain her without confronting her. The contrast was stark. Only a decade earlier, she had been positioned as a major dramatic force, an actress whose intensity matched the darker tones audiences were beginning to crave. Now she worked steadily, but quietly, present without prominence. The system allowed her to earn a living, but not to reclaim momentum. This distinction was crucial. Hollywood rarely denies work outright. It denies trajectory. Dvorak's defiance had altered how risk was calculated around her name. Casting her meant inviting comparison to her past, and comparison raised questions. Questions invited memory. Memory was inconvenient. It was easier to invest in performers without histories that complicated authority. So she remained active, but peripheral. Financially, the consequences accumulated. Smaller productions paid less. Gaps between projects lengthened. Stability became conditional on constant availability, even as availability produced diminishing returns. The security she might have built during her peak years had been deferred by conflict and never fully recovered. Emotionally, the toll was heavier. Dvorak had believed, perhaps stubbornly, that integrity would sustain her, that work done well would eventually speak for itself. The industry's response suggested otherwise. Silence did not mean reconsideration. It meant closure. Hollywood had not forgiven her. It had moved past the need to. Public perception adjusted accordingly. Interviews, when they occurred, treated her as a figure from an earlier moment, a name associated with promise rather than continuity. Journalists framed her career as one of unrealized potential, carefully avoiding any examination of why that potential had been curtailed. This framing absolved everyone except the person at its center. The idea that an actress could challenge a studio and suffer long-term consequences without formal banishment unsettled Hollywood's preferred narrative of freedom and choice. It was more comfortable to suggest that Dvorak had simply aged out of relevance, that tastes had changed, that opportunity had moved on. Change is a convenient explanation. It obscures causality. Behind the scenes, the industry's memory remained sharp. The same informal networks that had spread caution about her earlier continued to shape decisions quietly. No one needed to say her name aloud. The lesson attached to it was already understood. Dvorak sensed this undercurrent. She navigated meetings carefully, moderated her expectations, avoided confrontation. The intensity that had once defined her performances now had to be contained, redirected, softened. Survival required adaptation, and adaptation carried its own cost. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from maintaining restraint long after the original threat has passed. Dvorak carried that exhaustion with her. Each role accepted under diminished conditions reinforced the understanding that recovery was not coming, that the past would remain past. Hollywood's glamour had always depended on renewal, on the constant introduction of new faces unburdened by history. Dvorak, by insisting on authorship early, had acquired a history the system did not want to manage, so it managed around her. The 1,940 seconds brought broader shifts, war, changing audiences, evolving genres, but these changes did not restore her standing. They merely rearranged the margins. She remained capable, disciplined, emotionally precise. None of that altered the calculus. What altered her was time. Years spent negotiating around exclusion eroded confidence in subtle ways. Not through bitterness, but through resignation. She learned to measure success differently, to accept smaller victories, to adjust ambition downward. This adjustment was often mistaken for contentment. It was not. The long cost of defiance is rarely dramatic. It is cumulative. It appears in the narrowing of possibility, the quiet recalibration of dreams, the realization that certain doors no longer open no matter how carefully one knocks. Dvorak did not disappear. She endured, and endurance, in Hollywood, is often misread as resolution. The system preferred this interpretation. It allowed the story to end without confrontation. An actress makes a choice. The industry continues. Time passes. Everyone moves on. What this story omits is how thoroughly that movement is controlled. By the middle of the decade, Dvorak's place in Hollywood was fixed not by talent or effort, but by memory. She had crossed an invisible line early in her career and never been allowed to fully step back across it. The scandal that silenced her had done its work long before. What remained was its afterlife, a career permitted to continue just enough to avoid scrutiny, never enough to challenge authority again. This was not exile, it was containment. And containment, precisely because it feels survivable, can last a lifetime. By the late 1940 seconds, Anne Dvorak's life had settled into a rhythm that looked, from a distance, like stability. She was working. She was visible in modest ways. She was no longer the subject of studio memos or whispered warnings. Hollywood, having finished making its point, had relaxed its grip. What it had not done was restore what had been taken. This distinction mattered. Dvorak found work where she could on stage, in smaller film productions, occasionally in television, as the medium began to find its footing. These roles demanded discipline and offered dignity, but they carried none of the scale or protection that once accompanied her name. The industry welcomed her presence without investing in her future. It allowed survival, not recovery. To outsiders, this looked like resolution. The crisis had passed. She had returned. The system appeared flexible, even forgiving. What remained invisible was how much ground she had lost, and how carefully that loss had been normalized. Her career had been reclassified. No longer a leading actress with momentum, she was now a dependable professional, hired for competence rather than promise. Hollywood values this category precisely because it does not threaten hierarchy. Professionals fill gaps. They do not reshape narratives. Dvorak understood this calculus instinctively. Years of navigating diminished expectations had taught her what was possible and what was not. She no longer pressed for visibility. She focused on craft, on reliability, on earning a living without inviting attention that might reopen old judgments. This adaptation kept her working. It also kept her contained. The emotional toll of this containment was subtle but persistent. Dvorak had not abandoned her belief in artistic integrity, but she had learned to practice it quietly. The intensity that once defined her performances was now carefully measured, directed inward. Survival required moderation. Hollywood mistook this moderation for maturity. The industry's memory of her conflict with Warner Brothers had faded just enough to be unspoken, not enough to be forgotten. The lesson attached to her name remained intact. She was an actress who had challenged control and paid a price. The price did not need to be collected again. It had already been absorbed into her trajectory. As the years passed, she watched younger performers rise with freedoms she had once imagined for herself. Shorter contracts, greater mobility, the ability to refuse work without immediate reprisal. These changes were often cited as evidence of progress. Rarely were they connected to the sacrifices of those who had tested the system earlier. Dvorak was among those sacrifices. Her personal life bore the marks of prolonged instability. Relationships were shaped by uncertainty. Financial planning was cautious, constrained by years of uneven income. There was pride in self-sufficiency, but also fatigue. A sense that the most expansive version of her career had been cut short, not by failure, but by timing and resistance. She did not speak publicly about regret. Hollywood encourages gratitude, not grievance. Dvorak complied with this expectation, presenting a composed exterior that concealed lingering frustration. To articulate the cost of defiance would have required revisiting a story the industry preferred to keep closed. Silence, once again, proved easier. The cultural narrative surrounding her remained incomplete. Retrospectives occasionally referenced her early promise, her intensity, her independence. These qualities were framed as youthful traits rather than enduring principles. The implication was that she had matured out of them. The reality was more complicated. She had not abandoned conviction. She had learned how to carry it without visibility. What makes this phase of her life difficult to reconcile is how reasonable it appears. She was not destitute. She was not ostracized. She worked. She lived. Hollywood could point to her continued presence as evidence that the system was not punitive. But punishment, when effective, does not need to be dramatic. It needs only to be instructive. Dvorak's career became a demonstration of limits. It showed how far one could go after challenging authority and no further. The boundary was clear, even if it was never named. She existed on the safe side of it, careful not to test it again. As the 1,950 seconds approached, her roles continued to arrive intermittently. Each carried competence, professionalism, and restraint. None carried the sense of possibility that had once surrounded her work. The industry had decided how much of her it would allow. This decision was not revisited. Dvorak's resilience deserves recognition, but resilience should not be mistaken for vindication. To endure is not to be restored. To survive is not to be forgiven. Hollywood offered her neither apology nor acknowledgement. It offered work and expected gratitude in return. She gave it because survival required no less. The cost of this arrangement was not immediate collapse, but a lifelong recalibration of ambition. Dreams adjusted downward, expectations narrowed. The space where conflict once lived was filled with accommodation. This was the quiet aftermath of scandal, the part rarely recorded. Anne Dvorak did not vanish. She remained present, capable, dignified. But the version of her that might have reshaped the industry's understanding of artistic freedom was never allowed to re-emerge. Hollywood preserved itself by allowing her to continue, just not to challenge. The scandal that silenced her had evolved into something more enduring, a structure that rewarded survival while withholding restoration. And as long as that structure remained intact, the final accounting of what her resistance had cost was still unfinished. The bill, delayed for years, was not yet fully paid. By the time Anne Dvorak reached the later decades of her career, the conflict that had once defined her relationship with Hollywood was no longer discussed even indirectly. It had dissolved into atmosphere, into the unspoken assumptions that shaped how her name was received. The industry had no interest in revisiting old battles. It preferred outcomes to explanations. From the outside, her life appeared resolved. She was still acting. She had adapted. She was no longer fighting. This appearance of calm allowed Hollywood to close the file without confronting what it contained. The system interprets endurance as consent, especially when that endurance is quiet. Dvorak understood this dynamic better than most. Years of working within narrowed boundaries had taught her how easily history could be simplified. She knew that if her story were told at all, it would be reduced to a familiar arc. Early promise, personal choice, diminished prominence. The missing chapters, the coercion, the legal pressure, the calculated silence were inconvenient details. Hollywood did not deny them, it simply stopped asking. As television expanded, in the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds, Dvorak found new avenues for work. The medium was hungry for experienced performers, and she brought professionalism and emotional precision to each appearance. These roles provided income and purpose, but they did not alter her standing within the broader cultural memory. Television did not rewrite film history. It filled present needs. The distinction mattered. She was useful again, but not restored. Her earlier conflict with Warner Brothers was now treated as distant history, an anecdote rather than a turning point. Younger performers were rarely aware of it. Executives who had enforced the old rules retired or passed on. The structure, however, remained. New contracts looked different, but the logic of control persisted. Dvorak had lived long enough to see incremental change. Studios loosened their grip. Actors gained agents with more leverage. Artistic autonomy became a selling point rather than a threat. Yet these shifts did not retroactively correct what had happened to her. Progress rarely includes restitution. She watched from the margins as freedoms she had once demanded were granted to others without consequence. This observation did not embitter her publicly. She had learned that bitterness carried its own penalties. Instead, she absorbed the irony privately, with the restraint that had become second nature. The cost of this restraint was invisibility. In later interviews, when asked about her career, Dvorak spoke carefully. She acknowledged opportunities. She expressed gratitude. She avoided grievance. Hollywood trains its survivors well. They learn how to speak in ways that preserve access, even when access no longer matters. What she did not articulate was how thoroughly her path had been shaped by resistance and how much had been lost in the process. Not simply roles or recognition, but the possibility of sustained influence, the chance to shape narratives from a position of strength. That possibility had been closed quietly, early, and permanently. The industry, meanwhile, continued to benefit from the lesson her story provided. Actors were free to negotiate, but only within understood limits. Independence was acceptable when it did not challenge hierarchy. Dvorak's example remained embedded in Hollywood's institutional memory, even as her name faded from prominence. This is how power maintains itself, by remembering selectively. As years passed, Dvorak's work was occasionally rediscovered by critics and historians interested in pre-code cinema. Her performances were reassessed, her intensity praised. These rediscoveries focused on her talent, not her conflict. Art was separated from context, allowing appreciation without accountability. She became a figure to be admired retrospectively, safely distant from the system she had once confronted. What makes this stage of her life particularly revealing is its ordinariness. There was no final reckoning, no public acknowledgement of injustice. The industry did not apologize. Because it had never admitted wrongdoing, it did not need to. Time had softened the edges enough to render the question irrelevant. For Dvorak, this meant carrying the full knowledge of what had happened without the validation of having it recognized. She lived with the understanding that her resistance had mattered not because it changed the system, but because it exposed its limits. That exposure, however, remained largely private. Hollywood prefers narratives that conclude decisively. Rise and fall, triumph and tragedy. Dvorak's story resisted that structure. It lingered. It complicated. It refused to resolve neatly. As a result, it was allowed to drift toward obscurity. The silence surrounding her later years was not punitive. It was procedural. The industry had moved on, and in moving on, it had absolved itself of further responsibility. Yet silence does not erase consequence. It merely delays recognition. Anne Dvorak lived long enough to see her early work endure, stripped of the context that gave it meaning. She saw the industry evolve without ever addressing the cost of its earlier rigidity. She remained composed, professional, present qualities that had always defined her. What she did not regain was the space to be fully understood. The quiet aftermath of her defiance reveals something essential about Hollywood's moral economy. Those who challenge power are rarely destroyed outright. They are allowed to continue, diminished just enough to serve as warning, preserved just enough to avoid guilt. Dvorak existed within that margin for the rest of her life. Her story was never revisited because revisiting it would have required asking whether artistic freedom had ever truly been negotiable or merely tolerated when it posed no threat. Hollywood chose not to ask. And in that choice, it ensured that the final reckoning of Anne Dvorak's resistance would remain unfinished, suspended in a silence that looked like peace but functioned as erasure. The last chapter was approaching. It would not be written by the studios, but the conditions shaping it had already been set. In the end, Anne Dvorak outlived the system that had once disciplined her, but not the consequences it left behind. By the time Hollywood loosened its grip, the years that might have benefited most from that freedom were already gone. What remained was a life lived in the shadow of an earlier refusal. A refusal that had cost her scale, momentum, and the authority to shape her own narrative. History would later describe her as independent, even brave. These words arrived safely, after risk had passed. They did not restore what had been taken. They did not account for the years when independence was punished, when bravery was reframed as instability, when artistic conscience became a liability rather than a virtue. Dvorak understood this timing instinctively. She had learned early that recognition offered too late functions less as validation than as consolation. Hollywood's apologies are rarely explicit. They arrive as reassessment, as nostalgia, as praise detached from accountability. By the 1,970 seconds, interest in pre-code cinema brought renewed attention to her early performances. Critics admired her intensity, her refusal to soften emotion for comfort. She was celebrated as ahead of her time. The phrase carried admiration without obligation. It allowed the industry to admire the past without interrogating its own behavior. Dvorak did not contest these reassessments. She accepted them quietly, aware of their limits. The system that had once constrained her now praised the qualities it had punished. This reversal was not hypocrisy so much as convenience. Values shift when power is no longer threatened. What Hollywood never acknowledged was how much her resistance had foreshadowed changes it would later claim as progress. The ability to refuse roles, the right to step away without forfeiting a career, the notion that actors were collaborators rather than inventory. These ideas would eventually gain traction, but only after being safely abstracted from the lives that first tested them. Dvorak was among those lives. Her later years were marked by a measured distance from the industry that had shaped her. She remained professional, composed, and private. There were no public reckonings, no memoirs exposing conflict. Silence had become a survival skill long before it became habit. When she died in 1979, the notices were respectful and restrained. They spoke of her early promise, her notable roles, her longevity. They did not revisit the battle that had altered her path. The scandal that silenced her was treated as footnote, if mentioned at all. Hollywood closed the book neatly, but books closed without context do not tell full stories. They preserve outcomes without examining cause. Dvorak's life, when reduced to summary, appears to follow a familiar arc. Rise, conflict, adjustment, endurance. What this arc conceals is how deliberately the adjustment was enforced and how enduring its effects proved to be. The freedom she had sought eventually became fashionable. Actors gained leverage, studios adapted, the system evolved. Yet, evolution did not include restitution. The industry rarely returns what it has taken. It simply moves forward and calls it growth. Dvorak lived long enough to witness this evolution, to see freedoms normalized that had once cost her everything. This knowledge carried a particular weight. Progress did not erase loss, it only clarified it. Her story complicates Hollywood's preferred mythology of artistic freedom. It suggests that freedom was not discovered collectively, but extracted through individual cost. That the industry's flexibility was not inherent, but learned through resistance it later disavowed. The scandal that silenced Anne Dvorak was never about morality or decorum. It was about control. about who decides the terms of labor, the shape of ambition, the boundaries of voice. Her refusal to submit revealed those boundaries with uncomfortable clarity. Hollywood responded by narrowing her future. What remains of her legacy is therefore incomplete by design. She is remembered for performances, not for the conflict that defined their aftermath. The system preserved what it could absorb and discarded what it could not. Yet silence does not nullify meaning. It only delays it. To look back at Anne Dvorak now is to see a woman who confronted authority before it was safe to do so, who paid a price that later generations would not have to pay in the same way, who endured a lifetime shaped by an early insistence that art required autonomy. Her story does not end in triumph or defeat. It ends in clarity. Clarity that Hollywood's freedoms were built unevenly, that progress arrived late and cost someone early, that artistic independence, when it challenges power, is rarely rewarded in real time. The freedom Anne Dvorak demanded did arrive, just not in time to save her career from its consequences. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring scandal of all. Not that she lost everything for saying no, but that the system learned from her resistance while refusing to acknowledge what it had cost her to teach that lesson.